Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we're back in War Thunder and once again there has been another devlog today, so I feel like there are just so many devlogs going on that other content has been pushed aside, but this is for French tanks. It's the new tech tree which is going to be coming to us very soon. I think it's very important to look into these tanks and also the history of them. So yes, I understand if you're kind of getting sick of the devlogs and where's all the other stuff. But the thing is, I think it's worth going over this, so when I actually do reviews on these vehicles, I don't have to go into the historic stuff. You can just come back here and look at it here. So anyway, we get our taste of the first top-tier normal tree tank that we're going to get for the French. This is the Lorraine 40t. It has been said in the devblog itself that it's going to be rank 4. And my guess is around 6.7, something like that. So in this video, we're going to talk about the history of the Lorraine, why it came about, and also some other vehicles which we may see in the future coming, which are very similar to the Lorraine, but, different in slight areas. But since this has been added, it makes me confident to believe that the other vehicles we're going to talk about are going to be added as well. So let's get into the history of the Lorraine. We're not going to go into the company behind it. I think the information is interesting. If you want to look at the Lorraine Company, go for it. Maybe for another video I'll go into it, but not this one. I don't feel like it. So during the post-war period, so we're talking about late 1940s, early 50s, France wanted to develop a new tank because the main ones they were using at the time were captured German Panthers from World War II and also the short-lived ARL-44 heavy tank. Now the ARL-44 heavy tank, we're probably going to see it in game, and it's going to be a very fun vehicle to use, at least from my point of view and my playstyle, but in real life it had a bunch of issues with it, and once there's a devblog or in the 5 interesting vehicles, we'll go through it and talk about the issues and why it's needed to be released pretty quickly. Replaced, sorry, not released. I believe I said replaced anyway. So there was a project created which was designated M4, and it was aimed at producing a vehicle which would be around 50 tons, and it would allow France to compete against the other tank producing nations at the time. So we're talking about America, Britain, Russia, places like that. And the main goal was to try and revive the French tank industry, which was actually one of the best prior to World War II. Even though it had all of the production issues, the actual design and creation of a lot of the vehicles they made pre-World War II, so in the 1930s, were definitely state-of-the-art. They were let down a lot by some of the intricacies, such as stuff like radios and general tactics and things like that, but overall the tanks themselves were matched up or even better than the opponents that they were fighting. So the M4 project was handed over to the AMX company again, or time for me to butcher this one more time, Atelier de Construction d'Issy les Molineux, which created the AMX 50 tanks. Now the AMX 50s we'll get into a little bit later on. Those are probably going to be either late rank 4 or rank 5 brutes, for a good reason. Anyway, so the tank development continued its course through the 1950s, and the tank weight grew and grew and grew, so the initial specified 50 tons turned into more like 60 tons, and the reason for this is because they were upgunning and up-armoring the vehicle as they got more technology, pushing forward the tank design. Now, this was basically done to cope with the new Soviet tank designs which were coming out at the time, and it led to the authorities, instead of just sticking with the AMX 50s sitting at around 50 to 60 tons, they wanted to create a 50-ton tank which would be less than the AMX and would be able to be produced easier, basically, and take less materials. So, in all of this ruckus, in the late 1940s, during the M4 tank development stage, the Lorraine Company started developing a self-propelled gun, or an SPG, and the idea was to be based on a Jagdpanzer IV, but pretty much just fill it full of steroids and create this just ridiculous machine. And they created the Canon Dassault Lorraine, and this weighed at about 25 tons, and it was equipped with a SA 4700mm, and it could reach a top speed of 60 kilometers an hour. It also had the Vale Picard pneumatic air core tire and road wheels as opposed to a steel road wheel, which lowered the weight of the tank significantly. The road wheels were mounted on a torsion bar suspension with hydraulic shock absorbers, and many of the components that were taken or used in this Canon Dassault Lorraine were actually used in the 40t design, which, basically didn't start until, early 1950s. So they started on these SPGs, and then until 1953 the project was abandoned. But that doesn't mean that we won't see some of these machines in game. They were definitely interesting with the 100mm autoloaders and a decent amount of frontal armor on them. But anyway, while this was all going on, the Lorraine Company were also keeping a very close eye on the designs made by AMX, and they were also tasked to create a lightweight variant of the AMX 50. So what I was talking about before, where the AMX was getting to 50 to 60 tons, they wanted a more lightweight version, the government did, so therefore Lorraine totted up and were like, you know what, we can do that. So the design that they created, it combined the hydraulically operated oscillating turret and also the Canon Dassault Lorraine chassis, and that created the Lorraine 40t. So they pretty much took the oscillating turret from an AMX 50, made it a bit more lightweight, and then added the chassis of the Lorraine to it. And so the turret was designed by FAMH, or the Compagnie des Forges et Aciers de la Marine et d'Omcourt. I'm guessing is how you say that, for the AMX 50. And the turret for the Lorraine 40t was designed in two sections. So you had the lower section, which allowed the turret to rotate horizontally, and the upper section, which meant that you could depress and elevate along the gun with respect to the lower portion of the turret. This machine actually had a pretty decent depression. It had -8 degrees, and it only had plus 15 degrees, but -8 degrees is something not to be laughed at, and something that we'll see as quite a large advantage in the game for something with this gun. So, just like on the AMX 50 project, the 100mm SA-47, which was the same gun on the Canon Dassault Lorraine, the SPG we talked about earlier, was chosen to be mounted in the turret, which allowed the Lorraine 40t to achieve a very similar amount of firepower compared to the AMX 50. So, as I said, creating a lighter weight version of the AMX 50. Another notable feature of the Lorraine 40t, which was the same as in the AMX 50, it had a drum autoloader on it, and the main armament had 50 rounds stored in ammo racks within the hull itself. The fact that the gun was mounted in an oscillating turret meant that engineers were able to easily install an autoloader mechanism without worrying about the possibility of the limited vertical movement of the gun within the turret. And also the commander and the gunner shared a linked firing system, allowing both crew members the ability to operate the gun. So hopefully this is mirrored in game, where if a gunner does get taken out, you pretty much have a pseudo gunner which should have some very similar skills, or at least hopefully. So, like many French tanks which were prototyped and developed in the post-war period, the Lorraine 40t's engine was from Germany. It was a German design inspired by the Tiger and Panther tanks that were just around the French countryside at the time. You've got to remember, in times of war, a lot of, let's call it shrapnel, is left behind, and that does include fully functioning tanks sometimes, where you just have to abandon them and, go home. So some of them did enter French military service, but with looking at the Lorraine 40t, the French built a turbocharged, water-cooled Maybach HL230 V12, which they colloquially called the HL295. It produced 850 horsepower at 3,000 RPM. Crazy stuff, an amazingly powerful engine. This was the same engine that was used on the AMX-50, and the engine was also designed to propel much heavier tanks such as the Tiger and the AMX-50, meaning that it was an absolute powerhouse in something as light as a 40-ton Lorraine. This meant that the Lorraine 40t could reach speeds of 60 kilometers an hour during testing with relative ease, and it was about 10 kilometers faster than its heavier counterpart, the AMX-50. So in order to meet the requirements of weighing less than the overweight AMX-50, the tank... the tank had drastically thinner armor. So it was a welded construction with thicknesses of about 25 to 40 millimeters, and the tank was equipped with 10 Veil Pickard tires, so very similar to what you find on the Canon de Lorraine. And this pretty much saved weight over the steel road tires, which were very common at the time. And also, just as a nice little added bonus, adding these tires meant that there was a lot more comfort for the crew, reducing vibrations and shocks from the vehicle when it was in motion. Now remember, this is supposed to be a fast vehicle, so moving at speed is going to happen a hell of a lot, so comfort for the crew is definitely something which has to be thought about, and it definitely was in this design. Another feature of the Lorraine 40t you will see is on the nose of it, so the Pike nose design. This was similar to the second hull design that you find on the AMX-50, and that in itself was inspired by the Soviet tank designs of the time. If you look at the IS-3, it has this Pike nose design on the upper glacis of it. If you look in game, I believe the IS-4M has it as well, the IS-6 maybe, I'm not sure, but the IS-3 definitely does. And this had appeared in the Victory Parade in 1945. They'd taken note of it, and this meant that they used it to maximize the protection of the vehicle within the weight constraints. So even though it only had 40 millimeters of frontal armor, it was heavily sloped, and with this new Pike nose design, it meant that it had a much higher effective thickness than just 40 millimeters. The two prototypes were finished in 1952, and testing of the vehicles went on through 53 and 54, but they never reached the production stage, unfortunately. And it's not really their fault, to be honest. It's pretty much the fault of NATO, and obviously, you know, NATO's done a lot of good things. I'm not, you know, saying, oh, NATO should be abolished because we didn't get the Lorraine 40t, but just understand in history that is what happened. Basically, America, as part of NATO, just supplied a ton of M47s to the French at the outbreak of the Korean War, and therefore interest in the Lorraine 40t and AMX-50 wavered. It's like, why should we develop this and keep testing and produce our own tanks when we can just get a bunch of M47 patterns, which are seen as some of the best main battle tanks of the time? The high cost of producing and maintaining the Lorraine 40t and the AMX-50 pretty much led to the cancellation of it, and the M4 project was cancelled as well in favour of the vehicles provided by NATO. There was also further developments of the French main battle tank, but those come along in the late 50s in the form of the AMX-30 and the Leopard variant that the French had. This meant that the Lorraine 40t and its variants were supposedly the final attempts of Lorraine to re-enter the military market. That was pretty much the end of Lorraine, unfortunately, but they did make some very interesting designs. We may see a few in-game which isn't just the Lorraine 40t, but some tanks which were mentioned there. The AMX-30 and the Leopard. These are, I'm pretty sure these are going to be rank 5. The AMX-30 might be rank 6, depending on what ammunition they give it. I really hope the French don't get a premium pattern. I mean, the Germans already have one, but I suppose it would make sense if they do. But I want to focus on the AMX-50s. So there were two variants of the AMX-50s which were built. And one of the scary things about this machine, which we definitely, I believe, will see in game, is one of them had the 100mm, which is the same as the Lorraine 40t. The other one had a grand stonking 120 on it, which, let's just say, could do a bit of damage. I mean, it's a 120mm autoloader, meaning that it could fire shells at a rapid rate. It also had a 20mm MG151 strapped to it, and also a 7.62 MG, which I believe was in a coaxial position. The big difference between the AMX50s and the Lorraine 40t is the fact that the AMX50s had a ton of armor on the front. So the hull and the turret face had 120mm of armor, and the sides had 80mm of armor. Now, if you've seen any pictures of the AMX50, especially the 120, you will know how curved the upper glacis and the turret itself is. This thing is going to be a tough nut to crack, and I really hope it is put in a position where it is able to actually hold its own in, its armor. Let its armor actually do something. But yeah, that's the AMX50. If they do a devblog on it, then we'll talk about it more. If they don't, then I'll make sure to feature it in a video, because I feel like it should be in game. The Lorraine 40t, going back to its armor, so you're looking at the whole front, 40mm at 58 degrees, quite a steep angle, and will definitely ricochet a lot more than you will be, well, let's just say you'll be surprised at the amount of times this thing's going to ricochet. The whole side, 30mm at 30 degrees, so going through this should be very easy, even for a lot of, AA. And the turret is 45mm at 55 degrees, so once again sloped very harshly, and also may have a few areas of it where, I talked about before with these turrets, where the Comet in-game has a lot of parts of the turret which can move, or basically it has a lot of jagged edges. This is the same with this turret as well. If you hit it in slightly the wrong spot, it's going to bounce or it's going to get eaten by the armor. And even though it's not a lot of armor, it's not going to do a lot of damage. It's going to be annoying to fight these things. Because first of all, if you miss, you're dead, which isn't that different to what we see in game, but just understand you are more dead, because this thing, I'm guessing they'll give it about a 5-second reload on its belt. So that means that if you miss a shot at around 6.7, which is where I believe this vehicle will be around that point, you're going to get at least 2 shots fired at you, maybe 3, maybe even 4 if you're using something like the 120 2 that the Russians have. So you've got to understand that you're going to have to hit this thing, and it might be moving at 60 kilometers an hour. Now, its speed is a big factor. This machine, also the AMX50, did not have stabilizers on them. It was actually quite hard to stabilize an oscillating turret. So, since they were in the prototype stage, focuses were put in other areas instead of that. So that means in game, we have to know how stable this turret is on the move. We have a very fast vehicle here, which should accelerate incredibly quickly, and if it has to be a good flank and spanker, it has to have decent stability on the move, because at this point you start running into machines which do have stabilizers. The British come to mind, the Americans, the Germans, they all come to mind with their stabilizers around 6.7. Maybe not the Germans, but the other two definitely. So we're going to have to see how stable it is from a gun platform point of view. Something to also point out is the fact that it has a massive arse on it. Now this I generally don't talk about that much because it doesn't factor in a lot. But because this thing has a massive arse, that means that gun depression behind it's going to be quite bad, and also it's not going to be able to fit behind specific structures that you'll generally be used to. Because it's a wide load in that way, you might see its arse sticking out behind buildings for you to shoot at, so make sure you do shoot at its arse, since it has pretty much no armor on it. We're going to have to see how it performs against the other powerhouses of 6.7. You got the T-29, Carnarvon, Cent Mark III, Mark 10, the Tiger 2H. What else do we have? The Russians. Well, the Russians not so great at 6.7, but you do have stuff like the IS-6 and IS-3 just around the corner, and also the T-44-100. I feel like this tank will do well, and because of the policy in War Thunder where the first shot makes a lot of difference. The gun in itself has a penetration value of 220mm at 500 meters distance with its AP shells, so it's going to go through the majority of armor that it faces without too much issues, and that means that against Tiger 2Hs, I feel you're going to have to run in this thing. You're going to have to, you're going to have to run in the Tiger 2s against this. There's no way an autoloader doesn't just absolutely wreck a Tiger 2's face. But overall, really looking forward to this vehicle. I hope we see the AMXs as well. I think they definitely deserve a spot in the game. There is still a massive period in rank 2 and 3 that is unaccounted for, but hopefully in the next few devlogs we'll see them fill that. Hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.